I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and this is the largest ever Hyundai passenger vehicle, the new Palisade 3-row SUV. You can get it with 8 seats, unlike anything else in this segment apart from the Toyota Prado, but the one behind me is a Palisade Highlander equipped with the 7-seat option with captain's seats in the middle row, and this is a seriously lush family vehicle. It's an expensive Hyundai at $75,000 as you see it here, that you can get into a Palisade for 60 grand, but even in top spec diesel all-wheel drive form, it still represents pretty good buying when you take into account all of the toys you get inside and the sheer level of comfort this vehicle represents in the family segment. Plus, it's still $20,000 cheaper than an up-spec Genesis GV80, which kind of sits above the Palisade in the Hyundai group hierarchy. Now in today's video, we're going to jump into the Palisade and see just how premium this vehicle is, and we'll consider whether or not it has a better interior than rivals like the CX-9 or the Toyota Kluger. We'll have a look in the second and third row and the boot, and then we'll take the Palisade out onto the road, comparing the differences between the 3.5 litre petrol front drive and 2.2 litre diesel all-wheel drive versions. Before we get started, make sure to hit subscribe down below the video and the notification bell. Jumping into the Palisade, there's just so much content to this vehicle which makes it a really great family car. But that's especially the case for the Highlander grade, and that's the one I'm sitting in now, which gives you a choice between this very light cream leather or a burgundy leather, which is probably a slightly more practical option, whereas the base Palisade is available only with black leather. Now, this is not a cheap vehicle. Even at $60,000 for the base model, it's getting up there, but there are reasons why I think the $71,000 Highlander is actually the grade that most people should go for. And I'm not just saying that to encourage you to spend as much money as possible. I'm saying it because the Highlander steps up what is a good package in the base car to a really great package that surprises and delights you with so many included features. That starts with pretty comfortable Napa leather seats that have much more adjustment in the Highlander. The passenger seat gets power adjustment for the first time in the Highlander. In the base car, for example, it doesn't even have height adjustment, which is a big omission. Whereas if you step up, you get memory seats, you get heated and cooled seats in the front, you even get heated and cooled seats in the back if you go for the 7-seat option, which is pretty boss. We also get nice things like rear sunblinds, for example. We get dual sunroofs. We get a suede headliner, which is a combination of being very 70s and also just very luxurious. So I think that's kind of a cool touch. And at least on the beige leather, we get this cool wood effect pinstripe trim. All in all, it feels like a truly luxurious and lush vehicle here in the Highlander specification. Now, the basic technology package is the same across the range. We have a 10.25-inch touchscreen here in the center, and we have a combination of analog and digital gauges in front of us. And that's because the Palisade is about half a generation behind the updated Santa Fe or the new Genesis GV80. So we don't have the dual blind spot view cameras, for example. On the Highlander, we do have that system, but it shares the one digital screen in between analog gauges. It's fine, it's just something to note. Both grades get a 12-speaker Infinity stereo. Both of them have only wired Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. No wireless availability for those systems, at least not yet. And practicality, of course, is the same across the range, and it's really good. So massive console between the seats, as you'd expect for such a big car. Deployable cup holders, wireless smartphone charging, USB charging as well, and then even more space down here with more USB and 12-volt sockets. Decent sized door bins too. And while there isn't sort of incidental storage here on this bridge, there is underneath. In fact, there's such a cavity there that you'll get a small bag or a handbag in without a problem. Here in the second row, you can really see what I mean by the 7 or 8 seat option that you can choose at no cost extra in the Palisade. So Hyundai do think most people will go for the 8-seat version, just the extra practicality it brings. But what that is 2 benches in the second and the third row respectively. If you go for the 7-seat option, however, you get this very American style captain's chair setup, which is exactly how I would have the car. Not only is it good if you've got two baby seats, because you can keep them in place while letting people walk straight through to the third row, which is really easy. I can do it, but it means that you just have the most comfortable second row seats. In fact, these seats I think are a little more comfortable than those up front. They have lots of adjustment in them. You can slide them forward to favor the third row. You can bring them all the way back for super leg room. You can recline them, like, honestly, surprisingly far. And we have these armrests here, so you just feel totally settled on a long drive. Plus, they've got heaps of toys. We've got a fan zone and a temperature zone back here. And on the Highlander grade, we've got both heating and cooling for these rear seats. You only get the cooling if you go for the 7-seat option. They don't put that into the bench seat in the 8-seater, however. Got a 12-volt socket here, and we do have USB ports on the back of these seats. In fact, the car has 7 USB ports and 16 cup holders. So if you need more than that, then perhaps you need to be reevaluating your life choices. But all in all, it's roomy back here. Headroom is up there. Leg room and tow room are all very good in this car, as you would expect for a large vehicle with a good straight roofline. This really is a lesson in how to do a third row in a large SUV properly. Not only is the access to the way back in the Palisade much easier than in most SUVs where you find yourself climbing over a semi-folded seat, but once you're back here, you actually see that there is enough space even to transport adults. So that means that kids who are back here for a road trip won't feel like they've been shortchanged. If anything, they'll feel like they've got their own little world back here, kind of away from the rest of the car. But they won't be immune to your instructions, because the Palisade has a feature for the driver which amplifies the driver's voice with the Bluetooth call microphones and redirects it to the speakers back here. So there's no not hearing you. But in terms of space on offer, it's good. So I'm 6 foot, headroom, I've got another several inches. Legroom's actually fine. I've got these middle seats set to their middle position where I still had plenty of legroom when I was sitting in them, and tow room's all right. Now, yes, my feet are a little bit high. The base doesn't totally support my legs, but if I had shorter legs, I think it would be okay. Now, there are actually 3 seat belts back here, so that's how this is still a 7-seater despite only having 4 seats further forward. Now, the middle seat is pretty small, but if you're just using it for 2 in the back, then it is really comfortable enough. Plus, there's more cup holders back here, 4 cup holders just for the last row, and a USB port in each of the outboard seats, airbag protection that goes right to the back of the car, including the body, so it's a little bit better than the Santa Fe in that regard. And we have these air vents up in the roof too, so it's a pretty spacious and comfortable place to spend time, really, and that surprises me. Heading around the back of the Palisade, there's quite a few visual touches that sort of evoke the same attitude as the front end. So we have these stacked rear light clusters here. I think they're cool, pretty unique, and the Palisade doesn't really look like any other 3-row SUV on the road. As you'll see, that roofline continues very straight, very conventional, and that's why the headroom in the third row is pretty bearable. Now, there is a powered tailgate standard on the Palisade on both grades, and it opens up pretty promptly to reveal a good sized boot even with all 3 rows up. You get 311 litres of space, so about as much as a hatchback like an i30 or a Golf, but even though you've got so many seats, which is pretty good. You'll get some luggage back here, not as much as something like a Kia Carnival would, an MPV like that, but more than a CX-9, for example. Now, underneath, quite a sturdy floor piece here. There is somewhere to stash the cargo cover. The spare wheel is mounted underneath the Palisade, so that opens up a lot more space. You can drop the second row seats from here in the back. You've got a 12-volt socket, but dropping the third row seats is a very easy affair. It's not the most elegant. It's not electrically adjustable like the Genesis GV80, but it gets the job done easily and quickly and opens up 704 litres of cargo room behind the second row. Only issue is, if you go for the lush captain's chairs option, there's nothing by default to stop luggage sliding through into the cabin. So if I was going to buy the car in this setup, you'd definitely want to look at a net or something that you could put up to stop that from happening, but really it should be there by default. So what's the Palisade like to drive? That's really been a question I've been thinking about this year, because we were able to have a sit in the Palisade and climb all over it a few months ago. Maybe March, April. The timescales of 2020 are kind of difficult to memorize. But I was kind of like, is this thing going to drive like a bus, or will it be to our tastes here in Australia? And that's doubly been the question for me, because this is the first Hyundai SUV in a long time to not get an Australia-specific suspension tune. The reason for that is Hyundai Australia grabbed a Palisade off the production line that was destined for Eastern Europe, and the global suspension tune on this car was rated as quite adequate for Australian roads. And as it turns out, that is the case. And there are arguments that there wasn't too much more in the chassis to be had from a sort of costly and time-consuming suspension tuning program in the middle of a pandemic kind of do pan out. Maybe there would have been a little bit more, but the Palisade rides and handles in a secure fashion, which is what you would want from an SUV wearing the Hyundai badge. And in fact, the ride and handling is quite similar to the Australian tune of the Santa Fe, just with a few extra 100 kilograms on board and a fair bit of extra size. But we'll come back to how this vehicle rides and steers in a minute. First of all, let's talk about what you can get under the bonnet, because there are two engines and there's a $4,000 price gap between them. There's a petrol, a 3.5 litre naturally aspirated direct injected V6, pretty familiar engine. We've been seeing this around the traps in Hyundais for a long time now, and it produces 217 kilowatts of power and 355 newton meters of torque, which sound pretty healthy. The problem? It's front wheel drive only. Repackaging the Palisade into right-hand drive, much like the Santa Fe, means that there's no way to combine the petrol engine with an all-wheel drive setup, and so that means that you have an awful lot of power and torque coming to the front wheels only. And on a day like today, where it's pretty damp outside, that means you're going to get some scrabbling at the front end. And if you're pushing on, driving faster, and you need to put some power down on corner exit, the front drive petrol, which is probably a touch overpowered, just can't manage it. Even with Bridgestone Jeweler tires, they're not the cheapest tire or anything like that. It just doesn't feel fundamentally that well set up for this car, which is why I think the $4,000 upgrade to the 2.2 litre turbo diesel 4-cylinder exclusively paired with all-wheel drive makes a lot of sense. Now, once again, this is a diesel we've been seeing a lot over the last few years. It isn't the new SmartStream diesel. In fact, it's just the R-Series diesel that's been doing service in Hyundai SUVs for a long time now, but it makes decent power and torque, 147 kilowatts and 440 newton meters, and that torque is sent to all four wheels through the same 8-speed torque converter automatic gearbox as the petrol. But the whole symphony just comes together much more cohesively in the diesel. Firstly, it's really hushed. They've managed to make this engine really quiet, probably throwing quite a lot of noise insulation at the front end to make that happen, but it's worked well. It doesn't sound trucky, that diesel-y. It's a fairly small displacement 4-cylinder diesel, but it doesn't sound awful, which is good. And you just forget that it's a diesel most of the time, apart from the easy low-end torque, which is exactly what you would want in a vehicle like this. Plus, the fuel consumption is 30 or 40% better in the real world in our testing. We found that the diesel routinely used kind of 7 to 7.5 litres per 100 Ks in country driving at least, whereas the petrol was drinking more like 11 or 12. So even though there is a significant extra outlay to buy into the diesel all-wheel drive Palisade, over a few years of ownership, you're going to make that money back in fuel savings, is what I would suggest. But back to the ride and handling. So Hyundai SUVs do have this trait where they exhibit really good body control at high speeds on country roads, but they are a little bit fidgety in town and in the suburbs. And certainly the Palisade is a bit more, I suppose, unsettled at low speeds than a Mazda CX-9 is, even though both wear 20-inch wheels. And that's the case in both the base Palisade and in the high-spec Highlander, which does have bigger wheels. Now, we've only got passive suspension here, no adaptive dampers, so that's another way that the Palisade is quite similar to the CX-9. It's just that the ride and handling balance that Mazda have achieved is probably slightly more optimal. That being said, the Palisade is absolutely not uncomfortable. It is a very comfortable and plush vehicle. It's just when your eyes see kind of dead smooth tarmac and you can still feel the suspension kind of deciding what to do, that's where it's probably just a little bit ticked over too much into the control column rather than compliance, especially for a car like this. That being said, on the other side of that coin is that when you are on a country road in the Palisade, pushing on much harder than most drivers of a vehicle of this type ever will, it stays right with you. The chassis is pliant, it turns in well, much better than you'd expect for such a big and heavy car. The steering is pretty feel-free. but you know where the front end's going to go. The grip is decent, and with the all-wheel drive system on the diesel, it does a really great job of implementing what you're demanding of it in terms of what direction you want the car to go in, basically. And the stability control tune is pretty good too. Plus, refinement levels are high. It's a pretty hushed car. Gets a little louder on course chip, but it's noticeably softer in the cabin or quieter than the Santa Fe. And when you consider that a top spec Palisade is about $10,000 more than a top spec Santa Fe, I really do think it feels about 10 grand more expensive, both in terms of how plush the cabin is, but also refinement out on the road. I think most people would find that to be money well spent. There's also a bevy of safety features, AEB that detects pedestrians and cyclists. We've also got lane keep assist with pretty strong lane centering. We've got the blind spot view cameras here on the Highlander version, but both cars get blind spot monitoring. We also have safe exit warning that tells you if you're about to open your door onto a cyclist. We have rear cross traffic alert, and we have reversing AEB on both grades, which is important on a car like this. So those are my detailed first impressions of the new Hyundai Palisade 3-row SUV. If you do need this much space, if you're going to be frequently using the third row in a car like this, the big Palisade does make a lot of sense, and it should be on your shopping list, particularly as that third row is more spacious than something like a Mazda CX-9. Now, the Palisade isn't quite the Mazda's equal in terms of driving dynamics, but it's certainly quite composed, probably more composed than you'd think looking at a vehicle of this kind of size and mass. That being said, I definitely recommend opting for the diesel all-wheel drive. It puts the power down better, and it uses so much less fuel in the real world. Now let me know down below what you think of the Palisade in the comments. While you're there, make sure to hit subscribe and the notification bell. And as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.